Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about Edge Slice Rerendering with Gatsby. It allows you to do performant A/B testing, personalization, other dynamic content changes, even while keeping your static site generation. So let me just jump right in. I'm going to state something that's probably an obvious fact, but a lot of people moved to static site generation to solve some of the performance limitations of doing server-side rendering, right? If you have static site generation, it's cacheable by CDNs, whereas server-side rendering is not necessarily cacheable in every case. It depends, right? Some cases it is, some cases it isn't. It really depends on how dynamic the data is. But there's a key word in there, dynamic, and that's a problem with static site generations, is that many sites still need dynamic content, right? They need to be able to do A/B testing, or need to be able to personalize things, or do localization, or update pricing, and all sorts of just dynamic sort of things. Even though a majority of your site is not dynamic, there might be sprinkles of it here and there. And what do people do right now with static site generation to solve this problem? Well, that means client-side JavaScript. They bring in some sort of client-side JavaScript library, whether it just be some third-party library or just something that you wrote yourself. But the point being is they apply those changes client-side. And there's a number of problems with that. Doing it client-side in practice actually reduces some of the benefits of doing static site generation to begin with, which is obviously a little bit ironic, but also not necessarily well known. A lot of companies will go through all the effort of moving to static site generation or doing some sort of heavy caching policy or something like that, just and for performance, and then they throw in some third-party JavaScript library that tremendously then slows the site down. And they're wondering why. They're saying, I was promised fast websites. What is the problem? And the big problem is that JavaScript on mobile is slow. And I'm not talking about iPhones and all that stuff. I'm talking about like a Moto G4. That's pretty much an industry standard benchmark at this point. But there's lots of Android phones that are slow and all sorts of different devices. So why does that matter? Well, one of the things is that Google has recently said that they're going to be increasing their reliance on page performance as a signal for doing their search engine ranking, right? Starting in May, and that's huge, right? It somewhat remains to be seen how much of an impact it's going to have, but search engines are going to increasingly use that as a way of ranking your site against others. But also there's been a ton of studies that have proved this time and time again about how conversions and revenue are directly tied to the performance of your site. So if your site's slow, you're going to get less revenue and conversions, et cetera, et cetera. And so you speed it up, you get more revenue, more conversions. And we've seen it time and time again, and there's also been studies as well that prove that. So can we keep the performance of static site generation while keeping our dynamic content? And I mean, obviously, yes, we can. And that's Edge Slice Rerendering. So I'm Jay Phelps. I'm one of the co-founders at a company called Outsmartly, and that's exactly what we're trying to solve. If you'd like, you can follow me on Twitter at _JPhelps. So I think it's helpful to frame the problem if you're not familiar with it. And to do that, I'm going to utilize another company as basically a kind of somewhat of a case study. So butcherbox.com, if you haven't heard of them, they're a company that sells like the subscription meat service, right? They've got a website, right? Pretty standard, and they had moved to Gatsby. And what they would like to do is they'd like to take their Gatsby, Contentful, and Netlify and do all that fun stuff and do some sort of A/B testing and personalization and those sorts of things. But they're aware that the problems with client side are going to slow them down. So like, as just one very simple example, let's say they wanted to A/B test the hero banner image and the text, that headline text, right? So they want to do A/B testing and personalization. This banner right here. So let's just take a look at an example. Just swap that out with a different one, right? What if they're running a salmon and sirloin promotion and they wanted to see how well this performs compared to this other one? So client side, not ideal. What would be ideal? Well, I'm a developer, and and you're probably a developer, maybe not, but probably. So we got to thinking, let's take a look at the code, and the code looks something like this. We built a proof of concept for ButcherBox to basically show that, edge slice re-rendering, show the performance and the developer experience and stuff like that. And as part of that proof of concept, this is what that code looks like. So that's the hero component, and you'll notice that there are 3 props. There's the headline, which is being passed in, and then there's the call to action or CTA, and then there's the background. Well, if we actually drill into that component, the hero component, we'll see those props are being destructured, right? There was that headline, the call to action, the text color, the background, etc. And those props then go and get used just like here. So you can see the different places inside of the component where the props are actually used. So these are the things that are important, right? Those are the things that could potentially update. Well, wouldn't it be great if you could have a mental model of, like, I've got my new background that I want to pass in, but I don't want to touch any of the other props to the component. I just want to take the existing props, spread those in, add a new background, and somehow wave your hands and say, re-render that particular component only, and then put that on the page. But cache everything else, right? Cache the entire page, but only re-render that particular component and do it in some way that's performant, wherever that is. So obviously that's not real code. That's just pseudocode, and I'm just trying to explain it. But the point is, it'd be great. We think it'd be great if you have the mental model of being able to override props, but you kept the performance of static site generation. So how do we accomplish this? Well, if we go back again to that component, we look at those props. In the case of the background, we can see something important here. So there's the background prop, and then that background image URL gets used there, and then there's the alt inside that image. It's actually really simple. We don't really actually have to re-render the entire component even. We don't have to render the entire app, and we don't even need to re-render the entire component. We really just need to know where that image tag is on the page, and that we want to replace that image, that source attribute on that. That's all we really need to know. And we could, you could do these things somewhat manually, but it becomes, impractical to do it manually. So we want that. We want to only re-render a tiny slice of code. So, well, we love compilers. I'm a language nut. I'm an enthusiast on compilers for quite some time. So we had the idea, what if we automated this? What if we bring in static analysis? So that means we're going to analyze your React application code ahead of time during the build process. And we don't know what props you might want to override. So we have to assume that you could override any of the props for these components, right? Because we don't know. And then what we do is we can extract out the minimum amount of code. And that's called program slicing. It's just a fancy word for that. So what it kind of looks like, this is kind of hand wavy because it's a lot of code and stuff. But hand waviness, it's like we go through your code and we look at and we see all of these. We see that, okay, text color gets used here inside this conditional, which then ends up on theme, which then ends up inside this template literal, which then is used as the class name for this particular div on the page, right? And we're able to extract out that code and include a bunch of another analysis information and magic, and then we could automate this completely. So that happens ahead of time. During your build process, that information is extracted. Okay, that's great. But the mental model overriding props means that I need some new props to override, right? How do I provide those new props? Well, we came up with this concept called an override, which I think is probably aptly named. And this is what an override looks like for that background. And I'm just going to kind of step through it real quick. So you decide, you provide what component do you want to override. So in this case, it's by name. So you say hero, the hero component is what I want to override. Then you've got this lifecycle function, get override props. And it can be async or not async. And from here, you can define that new background just like we were wanting to do, and then you can return any new props for that hero component. Now you don't need to provide all of the props. You can just provide just the props you want to override. And then edge slice re-rendering figures out the minimum amount of JavaScript, the very minimal amount of the code slice to run, so that it can replace that value on the page, whatever that is, in this case, the background. And that's the magic of the static analysis, right? So in the case, if we went back to that page and we deployed that override, it could look like something like that, right? Then boom, it changed and did the A/B test. Now, when we wrote that first override, it was pretty simple, pretty oversimplified. And you'll notice that we didn't update that title. We wanted to actually not just upgrade the image, but also upgrade that headline, right? And we don't want to hard code things inside of our override. I mean, we could, but wouldn't it be great? They're using Contentful, so we thought for the proof of concept, wouldn't it be great if inside their Contentful, they could actually define A/B tests? So here is the example where you've got the home page hero test, and you've got 3 variations. Here's 1, 2, 3, right? And let's pull that up. So there we go, make it a little bigger. And inside those, we're not going to spend a bunch of time on this, but inside of those, you'd see that it contains the new headline, it contains new call to action, so new things for the URL and the background image, all that fun stuff for each one of those variations. And an override for this looked something like this. Now, I'm not going to cover everything again, but like here you got fetch from Contentful, which just, fetches from Contentful magically using stale while we validate. And that's a very important thing, because you don't want to always go to Contentful directly, because if you do, then the cost of going to Contentful delays your page, right? But we get those variations for that particular test. Then we do a uniform assignment, which is a fancy way of saying that we consistently pick one of these at random for this particular person, this particular visitor. And then we can take that assignment and those new fields from Contentful and then map those to the new props for the hero component that we want to override. So here, headline, text color, background, all of those are getting overridden, driven by Contentful. So if we were to deploy that now we would get the correct get free salmon and sirloin override, and the call to action would be updated, etc., etc. So if you're a little bit confused, there's one piece that I had not discussed. So we got overrides and we got code slices. Where do we want to actually run this code? So we extract the code slices ahead of time, and then we deploy these overrides ahead of time. And then, but where do the overrides run at runtime, right? They have to run during the request. And then the code slices have to run as well. Not the extraction of the code slices, but the actual execution of the new code. Where should that run? Well, we've already established, obviously, definitely not client-side, because that would defeat the whole point. And in the case of Gatsby, I mean, server-side is not even an option, right? And we don't want to do that anyway, because server-side is not going to be fast enough, right? Just normal server-side, re-render the whole page. That's not what we're talking about here. So what we're going to do is we're going to run it at the edge, which, you could say is a server, but it is technically a different type of server. So we've got edge servers. We've got a CDN where this code is going to run, proxying through to your origin, right? So if you're on Netlify, you're on Vercel, you're on AWS, whatever it is, you've got that origin, and the CDN sits in front of it. The edge sits in front of it. And so if you combine all of those things, we came up with a term just to simplify it, and we call that edge slice re-rendering, or ESR for short. And it's important to note the re-rendering, because we're not rendering the whole page. We're only re-rendering the minimum amount of JavaScript that was needed to change that value in the cached HTML document. So you're still using static site generation. You generate that just normally, you have it on your origin. When a request comes in, it's going to go through that edge, and the overrides that you provide execute, you get new props, and then the system magically figures out the minimum amount of JavaScript, runs that, and then patches that HTML document while it's being streamed in flight to the browser. And that's edge slice re-rendering. So we re-render just a tiny bit of the JavaScript app. And then there's a bunch, that's an oversimplification, right? Because it has to coordinate rehydration as well, so that it doesn't just get blown away client side when the React app boots up. So that's ESR. And just to double check and be very clear that this is not a replacement for static site generation or server-side rendering or any of that stuff. You combine it, static site generation with ESR. Or you could also combine server-side rendering with ESR if you wanted to. Like in the case of like if you're using some other, they won't name them, but some other framework that does server-side rendering, which there's many of them, right? You could do that. The important thing is you'd want to cache the results of that server-side rendering. Otherwise, you're kind of defeating the whole point, right? You want to cache that at the CDN edge. So someone is probably thinking to themselves, well, this is supposed to be faster. How fast really is it? Well, in the case of the proof of concept that we built for ButcherBox, which it ends up being tremendously fast, right? So 36 milliseconds is how fast we're able to take the page from the CDN cache, patch it while it's being HTML streamed to the browser, or execute your code slices, patch it, send that result down to the browser. So 36 milliseconds is tremendously fast, like especially because it's like, who knows how much of that is actually just latency between my house and the CDN edge. So in practice, a majority of the time, the edge slice re-rendering actually doesn't have any performance impact whatsoever because it has to execute so little code when you're doing that. And that's the beauty of it. You're not re-rendering the whole page. You're not paying, you only pay for what you actually need. So let's take a look at a real world timeline example of this. So on the left, we got the baseline, which is basically just going to be serving static site generation from the CDN without any dynamic changes whatsoever. This is the original version. And then we've got that same thing, but with edge slice re-rendering being applied to do that A/B test. We also included server-side rendering. This is using it's not using Gatsby, obviously, it's using another framework. And I want to note that this is not using external API calls, so it caches any API calls that it would otherwise need. If you needed to actually make API calls during the request itself, it would be slower, obviously. And then we've got static site generation with client-side, which is what vast majority of people are doing today. And this is using just a popular third-party client-side tool integrated with Gatsby. So let's go ahead and just run that. So right out of the gate, you can see that the baseline and edge slice re-rendering performed identical. Negligible difference in performance. They performed identically. But with edge slice re-rendering, we were able to take that same cache, the same one on the left, the same cached page, and just stitch together the correct amount of HTML with that new override. Server-side rendering actually didn't perform too bad. Server-side rendering is a crapshoot if you don't cache. I'm saying there's no caching on this server-side rendering. So it's a crapshoot because some pages are going to be fast-ish, some pages are going to be tremendously slow. This isn't that bad, but really you need to be under Google recommends being under 2 seconds. And this is on a emulated Moto G4 Generation 4 with a 4G connection. That's what this is running on. This is running from webpagetest.org. So then the last one on the far right is that static site generation with the client-side A/B testing tool, which performed pretty poorly. We tried a lot of things to get this to be as fast as it possibly could, and we could make it faster if we made the flashing content. So that's the real kicker with this, is that it has to have a anti-flicker snippet, if you're familiar with such a thing. And I'm not going to go into it, but the anti-flicker snippet really is what killed that tremendously. And particularly because what ends up happening if you look at the timeline is there ends up being contention with the image and the JavaScript assets that get loaded later because you're now relying on JavaScript to do this. There ends up being a lot of contention on this mobile device. So let's slow that down just a little bit, and we'll run that one more time. So you can see that they load pretty much identically. Server-side rendering is going to come in just not too far behind it. Here we go. And then the client-side A/B testing. Now, we're going to have to wait just a few seconds for this to come. And I want to be fair that this isn't, it's always going to be bad in my opinion, it's always going to be bad client-side. But whether it's this bad, it definitely ranges. I've seen way worse. I'd say the majority of the time it's actually way worse. But I've seen some that are in the 4 and 5 second ranges and stuff like that from other websites that we've worked with. So obviously the winner in this case is using static site generation with edge slice rerendering. So another use case is personalization. Any dynamic content, so personalization being one of those. As part of the proof of concept that we did with ButcherBox, we took a look at their website and we noticed that they have these recipe pages that they have for search engine stuff. So wouldn't it be great if you could tell that, like, oh, well, if they come in on a recipe page and it's using steak, well, if they go and they click on one of your internal ads or something like that and it goes to then your butcherbox.com, wouldn't you want this customized to show a banner about and steaks and also show any promotional offer that you're offering with steaks? Of course you would, right? That's personalization and just a good example of it. So if we went back to the recipes and tried looking at one of the bacon recipes, we'd get a similar experience where we get a personalized hero image and offer. So now I want to bring Jeff in. He's the head of engineering at ButcherBox, and just hear from him about a little bit of his insight.
Hey Jay, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Let me introduce myself. My name's Jeff Natick, and I'm the head of engineering at ButcherBox. Before taking over leading the engineering team, I was the lead front-end engineer and have been moving us towards the Jamstack over the last 18 months.
And what were you using prior to the Jamstack?
Previously, we were using primarily WordPress, as well as just vanilla PHP and jQuery kind of stuff.
And what was the motivation to moving to the Jamstack?
A few things. I had joined the company after using Jamstack for other clients and found that it was really beneficial to use a technology like Gatsby, and improve performance primarily was one of the first things. So it was kind of a no-brainer for us to move to that as we kind of rebuilt our platform.
How important has performance been?
Performance has been super important. We recently released our sign-up flow under Gatsby and saw a huge improvement in conversion, which we believe is primarily from the performance improvements of Gatsby and the Jamstack.
I know you all at ButcherBox have had a renewed interest recently in A/B testing, personalization, and performance, and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a big initiative for us this year, is building A/B testing and personalization into the Jamstack. And so we're working with things like Contentful and Segment and Optimizely right now to weave that sort of into the marketing site.
How do you think edge slice rendering fits into that bigger picture?
Sure. I've been really blown away, honestly, by your technology from what I've seen. I think one of the things that has been a pain point for us is client-side rendering of dynamic content. And there's a host of reasons why that's not always ideal, and perhaps is one of the minor drawbacks from moving from something like a WordPress server-side rendered solution. And what you have offered so far in our proof of concept has shown me that I can do things like instantly update a page from our CMS still. I can do super performant A/B testing and personalization and not have it be client driven and really get that performance from the edge.
Right. Well, thank you, Jeff, for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. Happy to be here.
Right. So that's edge slice rerendering, or ESR. Now, Outsmartly it actually plays well with all the stuff in the ecosystem. So, you bring your Contentful, your Segment, your Google Analytics, whatever it is, whatever origin you're using, whether you're using Netlify or Cell, all that stuff, you can bring that and use it as part of Outsmartly. And we're enterprise ready today. We did the proof of concept with ButcherBox, but we've been in production for the last year with other companies. And so right now we're increasing the availability of it. So if you're interested, you can the public developer access is available at outsmartly.com/signup. And the more information you tell us in the sign up form, as far as like your use cases and stuff like that, the more likely you'll get bumped to the head of the line. And if you're interested in access, right, the access we're giving on this is not. There's no commitment on pay or anything like that. We're trying to work with more folks to get more feedback and drive the product forward. So we also have we're releasing today a Gatsby and Outsmartly demo app that you can take a look at the source code for. You can take a look at the source code and just go to outsmartly.com/Gatsby, and it's going to show you like the code for the overrides for doing that personalization demo we did, and also the A/B testing demo, and some other goodness. And we'll keep updating it as things go, just so you can get a feel as a developer, like what kind of code. What things do I need to do to actually integrate this with my app, and what can it do, and those sorts of things. I think you'll enjoy it. So that's all I got, and thank you all very much. If you'd like to follow me, you can at Twitter at _JPhelps. Have a good conference.